Anxious partners are often wired to seek safety and connection. They crave closeness, reassurance, and consistency. But instead of looking for these qualities in emotionally stable relationships, they're often drawn to people who are unpredictable and emotionally distant. Why? Because inconsistency mimics the emotional roller coaster they've become familiar with, maybe from childhood, maybe from a past relationship, and their nervous system mistakes this unpredictability for intensity, even passion. It feels like chemistry, it feels like a spark, but what it really is instability. When someone is hot and cold, when they give just enough to keep you hooked but pull back the moment you get too close, it triggers something in the anxious person. It makes them feel like they have to work harder, be better, prove they're worthy of staying. It becomes a chase, not just for the other person, but for self-worth. And in that chase, the anxious person often starts believing that the love they're chasing is more valuable than it really is, simply because it's hard to get. What begins as an emotional connection slowly turns into a psychological pursuit. The anxious person convinces themselves that if they can just say the right thing, do the right thing, stay calm in the right moment, or give enough space when needed, they'll finally unlock this person's love. That this will be the moment the avoidant partner finally realizes how much they care and commits. But that moment rarely comes. Or if it does, it's followed quickly by withdrawal. And the cycle repeats itself: hope, disappointment, self-blame. This creates a strange paradox where the anxious person begins to tie their value to how much they can hold on, rather than how much they're being loved in return. They start measuring the depth of the connection by how much pain they're enduring. If it hurts, if it's confusing, if it feels like they're constantly fighting to be chosen, they start to believe it must be real love because it feels consuming, it feels intense. And to someone with an anxious attachment style, intensity has often been mistaken for depth. This emotional confusion makes them blind to what's really happening. They don't notice the emotional breadcrumbs they're being fed. They overlook how much energy they're investing just to keep someone marginally engaged. They ignore their own needs in favor of keeping the relationship alive, even when it's barely breathing. The inconsistency makes every moment of affection feel like a reward, a rare and precious moment that validates all the effort. But what's actually being reinforced is a cycle of emotional starvation and minimal nourishment. And it doesn't just stay in the relationship, it affects how they see themselves. The anxious partner starts thinking that if this person won't love them fully, maybe they aren't lovable in that way. They internalize the rejection, the withdrawal, the avoidance. They tell themselves they must be too much or not enough. They stop asking whether they're being treated right and instead ask what they're doing wrong. All of this reinforces the very pattern that keeps them stuck, seeking validation from someone who is incapable of consistently providing it. So they stay. They try harder. They invest more. They lower their standards. They justify behaviors that are objectively hurtful, and with every cycle, their self-esteem takes another hit. They hold on to hope because the alternative, walking away, feels like failure. It feels like giving up on love, when in reality, it's giving up on the illusion of love they've been clinging to. Fear-avoidant individuals are often deeply conflicted when it comes to emotional intimacy. On the surface, they may appear independent, self-sufficient, even emotionally reserved. But underneath that exterior is usually a history of emotional confusion, inconsistency, or neglect, experiences that taught them to fear vulnerability rather than trust it. So when someone comes along who is open, expressive, emotionally available, like an anxious partner, they are drawn in. They're attracted to the validation it offers, to the sense of being needed, to the emotional intensity that makes them feel wanted without demanding immediate vulnerability in return. This dynamic gives the fear-avoidant person a sense of control. The anxious partner is often the one doing the emotional work, initiating conversations, asking questions, seeking closeness, and offering reassurance. For the fear-avoidant, this can feel both flattering and overwhelming. On one hand, they enjoy the attention and care. It gives them a sense of being desired and admired. On the other, it threatens their emotional safety because closeness inevitably brings the risk of being truly seen, known, and possibly hurt. And so they oscillate, leaning in just enough to maintain the connection, then pulling away the moment things feel too intense. What this creates is a kind of emotional tug-of-war. The fear-avoidant starts to rely on the anxious partner's emotional labor, even if they can't fully reciprocate it. They become accustomed to the reassurance, the check-ins, the emotional safety net that the anxious partner provides. It becomes their comfort zone, even though they resist deeper commitment. They may not always know how to say what they're feeling or even what they need, but they grow attached to the feeling of being pursued, of being wanted, without having to do the vulnerable work of revealing their own fears or needs. This attachment can become subtly manipulative, often unintentionally. The fear-avoidant person doesn't typically set out to hurt anyone, but because they haven't resolved their own emotional wounds, they protect themselves by maintaining emotional distance. When the anxious partner gets too close, they shut down. When the anxious partner pulls away, they reach out just enough to pull them back in. They may not say the words, "I love you" or "I need you," but they'll send a message like a photo, a memory, or a compliment, just enough to reawaken hope, to reopen the loop. And the anxious partner, starved for reassurance, takes the bait. This cycle continues because it meets unspoken needs on both sides. The anxious partner feels a rush of validation every time the avoidant returns. The avoidant partner feels emotionally safe as long as they're not being asked to give too much. But beneath the surface, neither person is truly getting what they want. The anxious person wants depth, connection, and certainty. The avoidant person wants safety, space, and freedom from emotional exposure. So they remain locked in a push-pull dynamic, one chasing love, the other avoiding pain. The avoidant's reliance on the anxious partner's emotional generosity often goes unnoticed, even by them. Because they're so focused on avoiding discomfort, they don't always recognize that they're drawing emotional nourishment from someone else's vulnerability. And because the anxious partner gives so freely, it becomes easy to take that energy for granted. They begin to expect it, to count on it, without fully understanding the toll it takes. They don't see the imbalance because to them, distance feels normal. Intimacy feels dangerous. And so, when the anxious partner begins to assert boundaries or step back, the avoidant may feel confused, even abandoned, not realizing that their own emotional withholding has slowly drained the relationship of safety and trust. There comes a point in the anxious partner's journey where something inside begins to shift. After countless cycles of emotional chasing, second-guessing, over-analyzing every word, every silence, and every sudden change in tone, they begin to feel the weight of their own exhaustion. They start to notice how much time they spend managing the other person's emotions, trying to maintain peace, predict moods, and hold together a connection that seems to unravel the moment they let go for even a second. This emotional labor becomes too heavy, and eventually they start asking themselves a question they hadn't fully considered before. What if I stopped chasing? That question is powerful, not because of the answer, but because of what it represents. It means the anxious partner is no longer trying to win love through performance. It means they're starting to see that love isn't something you have to earn by sacrificing your needs. It means they're beginning to understand that being loved shouldn't come at the cost of their peace. And when that realization begins to take root, it changes everything. Slowly, sometimes painfully, they begin to let go, not out of spite, not to punish the avoidant partner, but because they finally see that the cost of staying in the cycle is their own emotional well-being. The things that used to feel like signs of love, those rare text messages after days of silence, the unexpected compliments that followed withdrawal, the breadcrumb affection that used to bring hope, start to lose their power. They don't hit the same way. They no longer feel like proof that things are getting better. Instead, they begin to look like what they really are, temporary fixes to a deeper pattern that isn't changing. The anxious partner, once so quick to forgive and try again, begins to hold space for discomfort instead of rushing to fix it. They stop internalizing someone else's emotional inconsistency as a reflection of their worth. they start separating love from anxiety. They begin to notice the difference between feeling chosen and feeling useful. As they grow in self-awareness, they begin setting boundaries, not as a tactic to get more attention, but as a way of protecting their energy. They take longer to respond to messages that once sent them spiraling with excitement. They stop initiating conversations just to maintain a sense of connection. They stop over-explaining themselves in an effort to be understood by someone who rarely made the effort to understand them. And these small acts, seemingly insignificant at first, begin to rebuild something that had been worn down for so long, their self-trust. What's powerful about this moment is that it's often quiet. There's no big declaration, no dramatic goodbye, no grand decision to walk away. It's simply a series of internal choices that shift the energy. The anxious partner no longer needs constant reassurance because they've stopped depending on a source that was always unreliable. They realize that the kind of love they want can't be built on chasing, pleading, or earning. It has to come freely from someone capable of offering it consistently. This internal shift is rarely easy. There are still moments of doubt, waves of longing, memories that resurface and tempt them to fall back into the pattern. But something has changed. They no longer panic when distance appears. They no longer bend themselves to accommodate someone else's emotional limitations. They've seen what it's like to be emotionally available to someone who fears emotional closeness, and they've decided it's not their job to fix that fear. That decision, quiet as it may be, is where the healing begins. Because once they stop chasing, they make space for something they hadn't allowed themselves to fully believe in before, a love that doesn't require them to lose themselves. When the anxious partner finally steps back, emotionally, physically, or both, it disrupts a pattern the fear-avoidant has grown used to relying on. For so long, the anxious person was the one holding the space, initiating connection, softening tension, and absorbing emotional uncertainty. That dynamic created an invisible safety net for the avoidant partner, one they didn't necessarily acknowledge but quietly depended on. And when that safety net is suddenly gone, the absence hits differently. It doesn't just feel like someone leaving, it feels like a mirror being taken away, a steady reflection of interest and care that can no longer be accessed on demand. The fear-avoidant individual, often caught in a loop of pushing away intimacy to protect themselves, may not immediately understand the weight of that loss. At first, it might feel like relief. Space, after all, has always been their preferred refuge when closeness gets overwhelming. But this time, the space isn't temporary. The anxious partner isn't just pulling back to provoke a reaction or to manipulate attention. They're detaching from the dynamic itself. And this is where the avoidant begins to experience a different kind of discomfort, one they haven't had to sit with before. There's no longer a message waiting in the morning, no thoughtful check-in after a hard day. No one is there to soften their silence, to decode their moods, to carry the burden of emotional connection for both of them. The dynamic that once allowed them to feel pursued without having to fully engage has dissolved. What's left is the quiet hum of absence, and in that absence, a very different kind of realization begins to unfold. Without the anxious partner's constant emotional investment, the avoidant person is left to confront the space they always claimed they wanted, and now they're forced to feel what that space actually contains. It's not peace. It's not freedom. It's not empowerment, it's emptiness. And for someone who has spent much of their emotional life avoiding vulnerability, that emptiness can be unfamiliar and uncomfortable. They start to notice the patterns that once felt protective now feel isolating. They begin to reflect, not always consciously, on the opportunities for connection they pushed away. The invitations to be known, to be seen, to be emotionally held that they declined out of fear now return as memories with a sting of regret. They may not have the language to articulate it. They might not even be able to label what they're feeling. But what begins to settle in is the awareness that the anxious partner wasn't asking for too much. They were offering something the avoidant didn't yet know how to receive. And now that it's gone, they're left with the emotional consequences of their own avoidance. They feel the silence they used to escape into, but this time it doesn't feel safe. It feels lonely. It feels like something valuable slipped through their fingers before they ever fully grasped what it was. This isn't just about missing someone, it's about confronting the part of themselves they've been running from, the part that longs for intimacy but panics when it arrives, the part that wants to be loved but doesn't trust love to stay. When the anxious partner stops showing up in the same way, when their presence no longer cushions the avoidant's distance, the emotional protection the avoidant relied on vanishes. And without that emotional safety net, they're forced to ask questions they've avoided for a long time. Why did I push them away? Why couldn't I open up when I had the chance? Why does the space I thought I wanted feel so cold now? Those questions don't come all at once. They surface slowly, often when something triggers a memory or when a new interaction doesn't bring the same warmth the anxious partner once gave so freely. And with each wave of that awareness, the avoidant begins to see the emotional cost of their walls. Not in theory, not as a concept, but as a lived experience of something meaningful that was once present and now isn't. At some point, both the anxious and the avoidant partner are left to face the truth that their dynamic is not sustainable. For so long, they've been operating in roles, one as the over-functioning emotional caretaker, the other as the distancer guarding their vulnerability like a fortress. These roles create an illusion of connection, but the foundation underneath is built more on survival than genuine intimacy. The anxious partner, often believing that love is something they have to earn through loyalty, patience, and emotional effort, sacrifices their own emotional balance in hopes that their consistency will be enough to change someone else. Meanwhile, the avoidant partner remains in protection mode, never fully stepping into the discomfort of being seen, understood, or emotionally available. This arrangement may look like a relationship, but it's really two people managing fear in opposite directions. When the anxious partner finally recognizes their value and begins to step out of their role, it doesn't just disrupt the relationship's surface. It pulls the entire emotional script into question. Suddenly, they are no longer trying to convince someone to stay. They are no longer contorting themselves to meet expectations that constantly shift. They begin prioritizing clarity over chemistry, boundaries over fear, and alignment over potential. And that shift forces the avoidant partner to confront something they've spent a lifetime trying to escape: emotional accountability. When both people are no longer playing the roles that kept them stuck, the mask comes off. The avoidant can no longer rely on distance to preserve the illusion of control. They must either step toward growth or watch the connection dissolve without the safety net they once took for granted. And growth, for the avoidant, is not about becoming perfect at emotional communication overnight. It's about allowing themselves to be uncomfortable, to stay when their instinct is to run, to listen when their impulse is to withdraw, to feel the pull to shut down and still lean in anyway. This doesn't happen in one grand gesture. It happens in small, often invisible choices. The decision to text back, to express a fear out loud, to admit they miss someone instead of pretending they don't care. For the anxious partner, growth looks different, but no less important. It's the commitment to stay grounded when anxiety tempts them to overfunction. It's learning to tolerate uncertainty without making it mean they're unworthy. It's refusing to chase people who only show up when they're slipping away. And it's trusting that real love doesn't require you to abandon yourself. Their growth begins the moment they stop trying to fix what was never theirs to fix and start rebuilding the relationship they have with themselves. In a truly healthy dynamic, both individuals move beyond survival tactics. They recognize the patterns for what they are, adaptations to past wounds, and they commit to choosing differently. The anxious person stops needing someone to validate their every emotion because they've learned to validate themselves. The avoidant stops needing to control the pace of connection through withdrawal because they've started to see that safety can exist even in emotional closeness. Neither partner is perfect, but both are present, aware, and willing to grow. This shift doesn't guarantee that the relationship will last, but it does mean that for the first time, it has a chance to be real. Not just two people colliding in their trauma responses, but two individuals showing up as their full selves. That kind of connection is built on truth, not performance, on choice, not dependency. It requires both people to retire their roles and do the harder work of being honest with themselves and with each other. And while that kind of work is never easy, it's the only path that leads to something deeper than the cycle they were trapped in.